Hi, everyone. Now starts the virtual part of our workshop. And we will have every talk recorded. So first of all, we will welcome Mike Bailey from Meta, talking about the role of social networks in economic mobility. So Mike is a senior social scientist at Meta on the computational social science team. His work focuses on the role of social networks on economic opportunity, including migration, health, education, and social capital. So without much details, I will give the stage to Mike.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. Please let me know if my video or audio cut out. So I'm Mike Bailey. I do a lot of work on social networks and how it relates to economic outcomes and things like migration or economic mobility or health. So today I want to talk about some joint work with a bunch of different people looking at how social networks connect to economic mobility and income. And so most of this talk will be about our two social capital papers, Social Capital 1, Social Capital 2, with a long list of amazing co-authors, primarily Raj Shetty, Matt Jackson, Teresa Kukler, Johanna Strobel, and then a little bit looking at social networks in India with Harshal Sahai. And so the early versions of what we're trying to do here is people who attempted to map out US inequality. So there's been a massive amount of work over the years looking at residential segregation in the US. And so the US has a very high degree of residential segregation by race, by income, by many measures. Like if you look at this map by the Washington Post, this is what segregation looks like in Chicago. And pretty much every major US city looks like this. So if you just color each dot by someone's race, you see that Chicago, while it has on average a very diverse set of races within the city, if you look at where people live, people are incredibly segregated by race and income. There is another set of more recent work looking at this notion of what is called experienced segregation, which is trying to measure how often do people mix within their daily lives? Like, do they go to the same parks, the same schools? Do they work at the same jobs? Do they go to the same coffee shops? And while they find that experienced segregation is not as extreme as residential segregation, that we still in the US live pretty highly segregated lives in terms of the businesses we go to, the parks we frequent. There's a project called the Atlas of Inequality that also tries to map out by income how segregated different places are around the US. And a lot of this is because we have cell phone data that we can use to track where people are going during the day. But there's a third big open question, which is how segregated are social networks? So there's this notion in social networks called homophily, which is how much your friendship networks look like you. And do you make friends similar to you or dissimilar to you? So we know that our social networks are pretty homophilous, but it's unclear how homophilous social networks are and how homophilous are they by income, by race, by SES, because we just lack the wide-scale social network data to answer that question. So that's the goal of this current project, is using widespread social network data. Can we measure how much segregation there is in social networks? An early version of this built something called the Social Connectedness Index, which is an open source data set looking at connections between any two places in the world. So this map is for San Francisco County, California, and it shows how strong socially connected San Francisco is to the rest of the US. And you can notice that social connections are pretty geographically concentrated. So most social links are to people who live near us, and as well as, as we know, there's homophily. We make friendships with people who are like us. And so we found that areas that with similar demographics have more cross connections at the county level. So there's more friendship links between counties that are more similar by income or politics or race. But this is at the county level. This doesn't tell us anything. This doesn't give us detailed information at the individual level. So the research questions we want to answer are, what are the economic consequences of having these very geographically concentrated networks? How segregated are social networks at the individual level by income and class? And then can we measure who therefore has the most access to resources in their network? Basically, who has these high income friends in their network, which is also known as social capital. And then does your social network impact your economic mobility? So are those who are able to form friendships with high income people, are they more likely to get a job, have higher income? Do those areas promote higher upward income mobility? So our data sources for this is we have de-identified Facebook social network data. So we observe for most people in the US, about 88% of people in the US, their Facebook friendships, interactions, communication networks, posting networks. We have demographic information like gender and age. We have, for many of them, group membership, like the high school or college they went to, the page likes, the location, which is either going to be at the census block group or zip code level, depending on the location setting on their phone. And then we take in external data like census data on incomes by block group or zip, and rates of economic mobility and many other outcomes at the county or zip code level. And then we assign everyone a socioeconomic status or an income prediction. And so what we do is we take people who have location services on their phone, which is about half of our sample, and we assign them the median household income of their residential census block group based on the 2014 ACS. And that's pretty accurate in terms of, because there's pretty little variation of income within a census block group. Census block groups are about 1,000 people. And so we kind of can trust that this is pretty close to, if our location model is accurate, then we can trust that this is pretty close to a ground truth for these people. And then we use that to train a machine learning model to predict the income of everyone else in our sample using things like their phone model, donations activity, Facebook tenure, age, gender, zip. We use a gradient boosted decision tree. And that way we can get a income estimate for everyone in our sample. And then we rank users in the national income distribution based on their predicted SES ranks. So just backing up, since that was a lot, take people that we observe a very granular location, assign them the median income based on the ACS, use that information to train a model based on everything we observe on the Facebook side, like location, age, gender, zip, etc., and then use that model to make a income rank prediction for everyone else. So that gives us everyone an income rank prediction in our sample. So based on that, we can answer questions like, are users with a higher predicted income, are their friends of a higher predicted income? And so that gives us this graph, which is the sort of main result we want to emphasize, which is how homophilous are social networks by income. And so what we find is, yes, there is homophily by socioeconomic status. So users who are predicted to be in the top percentile of SES, their friends are on average about the 85th percentile of SES, whereas users in the bottom percentile of SES, their friends are predicted to be in about the 20th percentile of SES. with a slope of about half. So this gives us our kind of first wide-scale evidence of just how much inequality there is in social networks by income. And we see that it's pretty drastic. There's quite a bit of inequality in social networks. The rich are way more likely to have friends with the rich, and poor are way more likely to have friends with the poor. And so a follow-up question of this, so this is US adults age 25 to 44, is we wanted to look and say, well, when does this process start? If we look at your first social network, say when you're a teenager, does it look quite as unequal as this chart would suggest? And so what we did is we linked high schoolers to their parents, and we looked at their parents' rank and their friends' parents' rank. And you end up with a graph that looks like this, a plot that looks like this. And what you see is that there's still quite a fair bit of inequality or homophily in the social network of teenagers. It's not quite as extreme as the one for adults. The slope is only 1/3 instead of 1/2. So for example, teens in the top percent, their friends would only be in about the 70th. Their friends as parents would only be predicted to be in about the 70th percentile compared to 85th percentile for the parents. But this kind of gives us a notion of kind of what are the processes through which friendships form in early life versus later life, and tells us that if we view this as a problem or a policy problem to solve, then it should start a lot earlier, and it's not just, say, a workplace problem or who goes to college problem. So if you take users and you divide them into below median and above median friends, then this is basically the picture we're painting, which is if you're below median, then about 32% of your friends are above median. If you're above median, then about 72% of your friends are above median. And so that gap is sort of what we want to try to explain. All right. If we look at that gap and look at it plotted by county, this is what that map looks like. And so the gap differs quite a bit around the US. So this is what we call that gap between the how many above median income friends do you have if you're below median income. That is what we call the socioeconomic connectedness score. And you'll see that there's places like in the south of the US where it's pretty low. There's some as low as 5 to 10%. So if you're below median SES, then only 5 to 10% of your friends are above median SES. But for a lot of the south of the US, it's under 25%, meaning if you're below median SES, only about a quarter of your friends will be above. Whereas there's a lot of huge swaths of the US, like the Midwest, North Dakota, Utah, where it is close to 50%, meaning if you're born poor in those areas, then by adulthood, you would expect about half of your friends to be above median SES, which is pretty striking how different social networks and segregation in social networks look around the US. If you zoom in any city, you get a similar pattern. So I showed you the Chicago residential segregation pattern earlier. So this map shouldn't be surprising given how extreme that Chicago map looked earlier. But by social networks, it looks basically just as extreme. You have areas like Inglewood with a poverty rate of 43%, where the socioeconomic connectedness score is only 9.6%, meaning if you're below median SES, then only about 10% of your friends are going to be above median SES. Then you have places like Edison Park, which is rich, white, wealthy, and their poverty rate's only 5%, and their socioeconomic connectedness score is about 50%, meaning if you're below median, about half of your friends will be above median. So there's really extreme differences even within the same city, even though they're very geographically close. So in our papers, we basically break down and compute 3 types of social capital. So this first type, which is what I've been showing you, is cross-type connectedness. So how are different types of people friends with each other? So I've been showing you socioeconomic status, but you can also look at like age connectedness, language connectedness. Another type is network cohesiveness. So how clustered are friendship networks, or how friendship networks are clustered into cliques, or how often do they have mutual friends, basically looking at the structure of the network. And then third is some of these more traditional social capital measures, which were very much in vogue in the 2000s, Putnam style social capital measures like indices of trust or participation in civic organizations, volunteering rates. On Facebook, we look at things like the number of volunteering groups or engagement in activism groups. And you can look at these different types of social capital types by area. So this is, for example, is average clustering coefficient by zip code or county. On the left is the US, on the right is Los Angeles. And you'll see that in the South, there's pockets of very high clustering, but also places like Florida with very low clustering. And within Los Angeles, you can see there's zip codes with low clustering, zip codes with high clustering. And so hopefully researchers can start to dive into these measures of social capital and understand why clustering differs so much around the US. This is volunteering rates by county. You'll see that the map looks very different than even the prior maps. Very low volunteering in the South, very extremely high volunteering in Michigan and the Midwest of the US. In LA, you'll see like large pockets of high and low volunteering rates. We haven't really had the time to dive in and figure this out, but this data is all public. So hopefully some of you all are interested in diving in and doing some interesting NLP work with the data set, or just like high level, why do we see the trends we're seeing in the data?
Like, just curious, where exactly are the data sets?
Let me go to this slide. So socialcapital.org is our website. So we have a data visualization platform to look at this data. So you can dive in by zip code, by school. You can look at, so it's at the high school level, or the college level, or the zip code level, or the county level. And so you can look at these measures of economic connectedness or cohesiveness or civic engagement, like pick your measure of social capital. And the socialcapital.org has a data visualizer where you can visualize the data, or you can just download it directly from the website. And so we built this so policymakers would have easy access to the data, but I'm hoping that you all can do something interesting on the NLP side. Look at, I would love to see correlation between Twitter, like tweets and measures of social capital. So for example, are areas with high volunteering rates based on what we measure on the Facebook side? Do people talk differently on Twitter about volunteering or, calls to action or whatever? I think that would be super interesting.
Great, I agree. And also a little bit context for the audio is that like we invite Mike mainly based on there are very few work tackling poverty in NLP. And then we want to get inspirations from social network scientists. And we could perhaps draw inspiration from this talk to how NLP could step in this area. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, there's so much NLP and social networks and poverty data and poverty type style things to dive into and tackle that I'd love to hear your questions and ideas on that topic. And so finally, we wanted to look at how predictive are these social capital measures with outcomes of interest like poverty, income, education, different types of things. Mostly want to look at how does social capital correlate with upward income mobility. So the ability of areas to raise people to a higher income level. And so if you look at just the correlation between upward income mobility and social capital, the top one is just correlations. The bottom plot is like regression coefficients. You see that economic connectedness is very, very highly correlated with upward income mobility. So areas that have a high degree of connectedness between the poor and the rich also are the areas that have very high social mobility, meaning if you're born poor, you're not destined to be poor. If you plot this by each point here is a different zip code. And so what you do is if you just plot median zip code by income, and then on the left is how economically connected they are, and the coloring, and I apologize for anyone who's colorblind because this graph will make zero sense. But if the colors here are upward income mobility, you'll see that there's a very high degree of sorting by basically economic connectedness here, that if you take a given zip code, a given band of zip code income, the more economically connected they are, the higher degree of social mobility they have. So like pretty much all the blue dots, areas that produce very high social mobility, are very highly economically connected. And while it's related to zip code of income, like you can see that the sorting is by the y-axis and not by the x-axis. So it really, economic connectedness matters a lot for social mobility here. And finally, we wanted to look and say, okay, well, why is there so much inequality in social networks? Why do the poor have fewer high SES friends than the rich? And so we wanted to distinguish between two mechanisms. One is exposure, which is how often are you exposed to high income people? You know, you meet them in your school, you have chances to go to the same institution, they're in your neighborhood, versus friending bias, which is, you know, they're in your school, but you're just not making friends with them. You know, so like a school might have a lot of high and low income students in the same school, but the school's just very bad at promoting those friendships, and so they don't form. And so, and then there's a third effect, which is based on what groups do you make friends in. So maybe the poor make all their friends in their neighborhood and the rich make all their friends in college. And that group effect might dominate here. So kind of we want to break down how much is a gap because of the groups you make friends in, because of the groups you belong to, and so you're exposed to people, versus the friending bias in your group. So this is your empirically observed gap of above median friends between the poor and the rich. And we found that gap is, you know, 37% for the poor, 78% for the rich. Again, poor means below median SES. When I say rich, I mean above median SES. If you equate the share of friends across groups, it doesn't change that much. So this is saying if I make sure the poor and the rich make the same percent of their friends from college or from high school or from their neighborhood, it doesn't change this gap very much. So the difference isn't being driven because we're making our friends in different groups. But if you equate exposure, then the gap is reduced by about half. So if I enforce that the poor's high schools, neighborhoods, colleges, et cetera, the groups where they make friends, if it has the same percentage of high income people that the high income people's groups look like, then you reduce that gap by about half. And then finally, if you eliminate bias, then that rest of the gap disappears, just because mathematically that's how we've defined our scenario here. But you can go back and start with eliminating bias and saying, I'm going to make sure friending between groups looks the same across every group, like force every high school to have the same friending rates between the rich and the poor. And then you would get about half of the gap to go away that way. As I said, the data is available at socialcapital.org. I would love for people to go in, try to understand this data and do some cool NLP stuff with it. So as a summary, why do the poor have fewer high assessments than the rich? We think about half as exposure, half as friending bias. Both factors are a function of the policies that affect structure and institutions. And friending bias varies systematically, so policymakers should really understand these bias or exposure effects when designing policies. I only have a few minutes left, so I'll go quickly through these final slides. But we wanted to understand, do these patterns hold for other countries? How does it relate to incomes like spatial mobility or migration? What are consequences for things like urbanization? And so we looked at similar data for India in a different paper called Social Networks of Spatial Mobility, Evidence from Facebook in India. And India has a very large urbanization difference than other countries. You have very high income, highly urbanized places like Delhi, and then many rural areas with very low urbanization, very low income. And the question is why? Why is there such a large difference within the same country? And so in this paper, we find that richer and more educated people have more social capital, and that makes them more likely to migrate. Richer people migrate to richer areas, and labor migrants have much more mobility. In our model, we find that a lot of the differences being driven by social networks. People have a strong preference to move to where their friends are. Labor migrants move to where their friends are. And if you basically reallocate social networks, so you make social networks equal between people, then you could get a huge jump in income, especially for the poor. So we estimate that equalizing social networks would lead to a 3 to 7% increase in GDP, and about 24 to 20% for low-income people. Just focusing on the graph on the right, this is the homophily in social networks. You find that people who live in the bottom quartile of income in their home district, their friends, 65% of their friends live in that bottom quartile. And that number jumps to about 83% for those living in the top quartile by district. So you just find these extreme inequality in friending rates between the rich and the poor. And then that translates to migration rates, which is the plot on the left, that poor people move to poor areas, rich people move to rich areas. And then if you look at where people form the social capital, in India, college plays a large role. So the difference between this plots the difference between people who went to college and didn't, and you see that their network size, just the gap between their network sizes grows over time. And then the gap in their friend's income grows over time. So if you look at something like their average friend phone price, which is a proxy for income, that difference just grows over time. So just recapping, we find that there is inequality in social networks. Networks reduces the migration distance relationship by about 20%. Then, one second, increasing social connections reduces migration frictions. And sorry, I just had a kid wake up. Destination specific policy may not eliminate that network reliance. social capital can be gained through education. So that is everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Let
much,
me
Mike, for the
stop sharing.
sharing and the perfect time control. So I have lots of questions in my mind, but we'll move the questions together in the live Q&A session 30 minutes later. So as a brief overview for the participants, the schedule for this part of the conference will be several invited talks, QA for every 2 talks, and so on.